Alors, bonjour et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à la deuxième conférence du cycle des leçons du mardi. Comme on a dit la semaine passée, le titre de la série est Multitude de pièces. Et le cycle des leçons vise à discuter les concepts et les rôles de la pièce au sein de l'habitat. Et ça aussi à la suite des développements des phénomènes sociaux et environnementaux et dans les contextes européens et occidentaux, ainsi que dans d'autres traditions mondiales. Et à travers les différentes conférences, nous parlerons du changement du rôle de la pièce dans les logements. Nous parlerons de certains éléments individuels de la pièce, éléments comme la table ou les lits, éléments qui, si conçus comme des systèmes interconnectés, peuvent mettre en évidence une nouvelle perspective pour la domesticité. Nous parlerons également des espaces collectifs du bâtiment, de la ville ou du territoire. Nous parlerons d'appartenance et d'attachement à certains espaces de conflit et probablement ça sera l'un des sujets de la conférence d'aujourd'hui. Nous parlerons d'espaces collectifs que nous pouvons considérer comme des biens communs et qui sont de plus en plus importants pour la genèse d'un sentiment de communauté et le développement d'habitats caractérisés par la coexistence des différentes espèces vivantes. And today we have the honor to host Ruba Salih, anthropologist, since 2022 professor at the Department of the Arts of the University of Bologna. With me, we are colleagues in Bologna. And in Bologna, she teaches anthropology, curatorship, and gender studies in its intersection with race, space, and place. Before joining Bologna, she was a professor in the Department of Anthropology at SOAS, University of Bologna. University of London, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. She also held a position as a senior lecturer at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies of the University of Exeter, and she has been a visiting scholar at Brown University, at the University of Cambridge, and at the University Ca' Foscari in Venice. Currently, she is in the executive board of ISANIAT, a society of Palestinian anthropologists. And she has published several essays on the topic of migrant women, diaspora, decolonization, intersectionality, and on refugee camps. And today, Ruba offers us a lecture entitled Unhoming and rehoming in Palestinian refugee camps. And I think it is clear to everyone how important it's to discuss the issue Ruba Salih will be talking about in relation to the tragedy that is happening of the people of Gaza. So thank you very much, Ruba, and I give you the floor for your conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't speak in French, although I understand French, but my French is too weak to be able to deliver this in French, so I'm going to have to speak in English. I have to first give you a premise. I'm a Palestinian scholar, European Palestinian scholar, And I've been working on Palestinian refugees for the past 15 years, especially around issues of camps and what is a camp, a refugee camp today after 75 years of displacement. However, after the 7th of October, it has become very difficult to think about our past work as scholars of Palestine or scholars of refugeehood, because everything has changed. There's nothing that is that has more that has a significance that belongs to the past. We have to. In fact, we find it really difficult, and I find it really difficult to speak about my past work in the light of the current events, because I think we are at a situation where, as also the International Court of Justice declared, we are witnessing a plausible genocide, and we are at the limit of the thinkable, you know, with news of family, friends, and colleagues, and students, and loved ones who are no longer with us. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is I'm trying to kind of think about the notion of home as a lens to understand what is going on in Gaza and in Palestine, and also how home can give us or offer us a horizon for the future as well. Now, how do I? Okay, I can't move this thing. It doesn't. Okay. So I'm sure you're familiar with, for those of you who have been following the news, with the notion of more or less what's been going on. Even for those who don't want to follow, this is a televised massacre that is happening in front of our eyes. So we are exposed to images, willing or nilling, of what is Gaza today. So this is one of the images that conveys at the very basic level what is going on. There is complete destruction, and in this picture you can see two young people collecting what remains of their home, okay, which has been destroyed and reduced to rubbles. And they are collecting some books and some blankets, but it already gives you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. That is to say that as part of the plausible genocide, how it is defined by the International Court of Justice, there is something that is happening that is called domicide. That is to say, the consistent and deliberate attempt to destroy infrastructure, to destroy homes, to destroy the very quintessential basic place where people conduct their lives, their ordinary lives, which is their homes, both symbolically and as infrastructure. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context. So there is a definition for domicide. There are publications that pre-exist the Gaza context, but the very basic definition is widespread deliberate destruction of the home to make it inhabitable, preventing the return of displaced people. The context of Gaza obviously is one where, as I will be talking about in a minute, there have been 16 years of siege for international by Israel, meaning that the whole Gaza Strip has been encircled with impossibility to come and go unless with, encircled by walls and fences. So it's the biggest prison on earth, as has been defined by scholars. And it has been subjected to not only a 16, 17 now years of siege, but also to 5 previous bombing and wars. And to the wholesale destruction of the built environment, including homes, so all kinds of infrastructures for many times, although this time is obviously the most tremendous. So in scholarship, scholars argue that there is extreme genocide and everyday domicide, extreme domicide and everyday domicide, because obviously domicide has been taken also to denote the various forms of dispossession, evictions, the kind of reducing into very precarious state of being of multiple types of communities in neoliberal, capitalist, late capitalist contexts where, you know, the losing home is unfortunately a very common experience in different parts of the world. So what we're talking about in Gaza is both an everyday homicide and an extreme, domicide. Just to give you some numbers, 142,900 between this and nearly, 176,000 buildings have been damaged as of 17th January 2024, meaning that between 60 and 70% of homes have been razed to the ground. Together with that, there is the destruction of the whole university system. 7 out of 12 universities have been reduced to rubble. 370 schools have been bombed and destroyed. Hospitals are reduced to the bare minimum. Cemeteries have been destroyed and bodies digged out. Greenhouses, satellite dishes, churches, mosques, and so on and so forth. So you get a sense of what we mean by domicide is the destruction of home and all the possibilities of existence, of sustenance for a population. You know, considering that, as I said, there have been 5 previous wars, and that 70% of Gaza's 2 million residents are not yet 30. They are not yet in the 30 years zone. You have an entire population. 70% of the population of Gaza has not seen anything else than war, has lived an entire life, and I'm talking about 70% of the population has never seen anything but war and offense that they cannot cross. But before the current war on Gaza, the situation was such that there was a domicide in the sense that 80% of the water was not drinkable, 60% of the people were unemployment because of the siege and because of the constant destruction due to the wars, and a situation where this affected the population in dramatic ways. A report by Save the Children in 2022 discussed that how 4 out of 5 children lived in sheer loss and grief, and a high number of them were committing self-harm and thinking of suicide. Already in 2021, the United Nations had declared Gaza as nearly uninhabitable because of the conditions. So I don't know how familiar you are with the notion of necropolitics, but I think that even before 2020, October 7th, and in the past 5 months, and what's been unfolding in these past months, one could easily apply the concept of necropolitics to Gaza, a concept that has been coined by political theorist, Cameroonian political theorist Achille Mbembe, where he talks about, the ways in which the sovereign has shifted its prerogative from, one that is about making people live to one where the right to kill masses of people is more and more what defines sovereignty, what defines power. So there is, I think, this concept, and with this concept of necropolitics, there is the idea that, for a lot of people in the global south, and certainly this is the case for the people of Gaza today and before, lives are intermitted by constant death. That is to say that death is what defines your quality of life, okay? So this is the kind of context. Now, this is not new. If one, a lot of us working on Palestine have been trying to find words to understand and define what is this that is happening today. Is this a new Nakba, which is the word that Palestinians used to define the original displacement and dispossession of Palestinians when in 1948, when Israel came into being? What is it? And the magnitude of this is so unprecedented that we are at a loss with words to define, in our history, this has never been, the case. So, but it's important also to kind of trace in the genealogy of this kind of destruction, because this is, a lot of people would say this is a reaction to the Hamas attack of October the 7th, and Israel for sure says this is self-defense. But if one looks at the history of this conflict, let's call it that way, there is a sense that of a continuous attempt to displace and dispossess and erase the Palestinians as native of the land to make place for a new community of people who have to become the new indigenous. And if, you are all architects and you're maybe not familiar with this kind of literature, but there is a whole literature of settler colonial studies that explains how the erasure of the built environment, of nature, of anything that pre-exists the arrival of the new settler community is almost a necessary condition for the new settlers to make themselves into the new indigenous. And in this process, and this is really interesting, I mean, I'm not going to go and read all of this because I'm already 20 past, it's already 20 past. But this was something that, in the early 1930s, there was already the sense that to make this happen, to make the new indigenous, the settlers into the new indigenous, you had not only to displace the original inhabitants, the native Palestinians. At the time, in between the 30s and in 1948, 2/3 of the population was obliged to flee and seek refuge elsewhere, but also to fossilize the environment in order to destroy, erase everything that pre-existed. It's, humans' entanglement with their nature, everything that was signifying the previous existence, the previous life had to be buried. And this notion of fossilization, which I find extremely cogent to think through, was in fact the notion that Joseph White, who was at the head of the transfer committees between the 1930s and 1948, which were in charge of displacing the local indigenous population of Palestinians, he thought of this process of destruction of hundreds of villages then, and the disappearance of the previous life world in terms of fossilization. And I heard Anna talking about the relationship with nature, with environment. This is certainly a really interesting aspect of the story. Now, fossilization was not just about the erasure of life. It's about what anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli defined, a kind of new power that comes into being, which she calls geontopower. It's a power that the settler colonial system gives itself to arbitrarily decide what is life and what is not life. To distinguish, to create, to ontologically differentiate between life and non-life. So we are not talking about the realm of, human versus nature, or nature that is destroyed in this process together with the built environment, the villages. We are talking about a wholesale ontologization of anything that pre-exists as non-life, okay? And therefore, something that even predates dehumanization, because to dehumanize, you first have to recognize that there is some human there. But this process of fossilization, of attribution of a non-life character to what pre-exists is what is at stake, okay? It's an ontological, it's the power to ascribe an essence of non-life to the indigenous and to the indigenous life world. Now, again, thinking about the past, you have Theodor Herz, who was one of the founding fathers of Zionism, which is the national ideology that accompanied the coming into being of the State of Israel. who argued, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And here I would like to quote this because, this is what he talks about in terms of the language that is being forged at the time to define and to accompany this process. It's a language that stands for what I've been just saying, stands for this geontopower attribution to the settler colonial power of deciding what stands for what is nature and what is not, what is human and what is not. But also the way in which they thought about environment back then. So, this is a quote where he says, I had a long walk with the electrical engineer. He is a good Zionist with modern ideas. Great chemical industries could be established on the shores of the highly sulfurous Dead Sea. The streams that feed it would be diverted and used for drinking purposes. They would be replaced by a canal from the Mediterranean, part of which would have to pierce the hill through a tunnel, a tourist spectacle. The difference between the levels of the two sea waterfall could be utilized for driving machines, many thousands of horsepower. So you have a very clear sense of the kind of environmental ethics that is at work here. It's an environmental ethic that stands in complete stark contrast with an indigenous life world and way of thinking about nature, okay? It's about penetrating, shriveling, having a futuristic imaginary that also is accompanies an ethic of redemption for the new settlers, which see this kind of technological progress as needed for the elimination of the previous life world, the agrarian systems, the built environment, and everything that pre-existed. Now, let me now move on to, this is a sort of long introduction to what I wanted to talk about to you today, which is home, via the lens of domicide, as I said. So I wanted to go into more the nitty-gritty meaning of what it means to lose home. We think about wars, we think about destruction, we think about the killing, but what does it mean to think of war as the loss of home? The destruction of home. It means so many different things. But also, I think home, as it will be clear towards the end of this lecture, is also where we need to start thinking about, the future. Now, there are many, many testimonies that have, unfortunately, not enough, or even if there are many testimonies, there haven't been many people hearing or listening. So these testimonies haven't been so audible, and that's why I want to bring you some testimonies to your attention. Two that strike me as really relevant for this discussion are one from Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's a medical doctor who was one of the few doctors from not from Gaza, who was in Gaza all over these months. He's a British Palestinian doctor, surgeon. And he was there operating, in these very dire conditions with no instruments, and he's released many interviews since he's come back to London to talk about the conditions in which doctors and health facilities were operating in these months, and it's quite heartbreaking to hear. But one of the things that really stood out for me in one of the interviews he's released with anthropologist Ghassan Haj, which is published in Ghassan Haj's blog, is he describes how doctors, as well as everyone else, rescuers, they have been obliged to make really inhuman decisions about who to save because of the lack of resources and because of the lack of, ambulances were shot at. In hospitals, you had literally people lying on the floor, and the choice was made sometimes, who to take out of the rubble based on who has most possibility of surviving, which is quite inhuman if you have 3 kids or your mother and your kid under the rubbles. And you have to make that kind of choice. But in hospitals, sometimes there had to be also a choice to be made on who to save. And he describes how, in the face of the fact that there have been 1,800 families, intergenerational families of, sometimes 100, composed of hundreds of people, have been entirely wiped out. And so saving, the surgeons had to make these choices of who to save based also on the idea that saving one person who's the last only remaining alive person of that intergenerational family means allowing a future for this family, allowing the possibility of a continuation of and so how the environment of the hospital becomes, the surgery room becomes a space of preserving a social texture, a memory, and possibility of allowing a future for those who otherwise will no longer exist as communities, which I found really interesting and compelling to think about. But I also wanted to go back to the idea, what does it mean to lose home? And I'm sure you are very acquainted with the literature on homes as built environment, what the kind of social relations and the issue of the domestic, what the domestic stands for beyond the idea of private and of privacy and of it's really, and I've written about this in my previous work, it's really where, especially in contexts of war and displacement, home becomes and is the place where you maintain a sense of continuous presence over erasure, is where a sense of protection is in the face of total annihilation that happens outside is preserved. It's where your memories belong. It's where your sense of belonging is. It's also where your conflicts are and where they are resolved, in terms of social relations and domestic and gender relations. So destroying homes means destroying a community, to quote, destroying all the relations that sustain a community. It is not just the loss of the infrastructure that we are talking about. We are talking about the loss of community. So I think it's really interesting to think about the loss of home in those terms, but also thinking about home and domesticity and the loss of the ordinary helps us to rethink also what is lost in war. It is not that people just lose a homeland or lose an imaginary kind of sense of a place that they belong to. They lose the possibility of the ordinary, and the idea of where the eventful is, seen from the lens of the loss of home, is also interesting to think through, because the eventful is not just the date where the the dates of the big events. It's in the ordinary. It's in the for those of us like myself who have conducted long-term field work with Palestinian refugees over generations, when you talk to women, for instance, of a certain generation, it's very clear where the eventful is for them. It is not in the big dates. It is in the loss of domesticity, the loss of sometimes, the minutiae of the space that they have built and rebuilt and that was destroyed, and that maintained a sense of continuation. Okay, so, and I wanted to offer you this testimony from a feminist community worker from Gaza, who I think really, her words really convey a very deep and clear sense of what I'm talking about here, and what the domestic becomes and represents, and what the tasks of carrying out the ordinary, everyday acts of survival and life, what do they mean in the context of destruction, of wholesale destruction. So sorry for the long quote, but I think it really bears citation. This was actually already on the 7th of October, so a month in the war. Good morning. Since the war began exactly 30 full days ago, I have evaded writing about its horrors that we have been suffering instantaneously and continuously in Gaza. I have even evaded talking to foreign and local journalists who have contacted me, some of whom are old friends of mine or friends of friends. I evaded using various pretexts and justifications, including the racket made by the many children around me and my laying in ambush of their small wars. Sorry, not the racket, the rocket. and my laying in ambush of their small wars, trying to prevent them before they break out or to extinguish them as they start. Okay, this is what's happening in the shelter where they have found refuge. And I am the grandmother who is trying to be firm and fair between her grandchildren and the many other children here, where we found refuge from Gaza City, which we fled twice with my daughter-in-law's family and relatives. First fleeing to two different hotels, then once again fleeing to my relatives here in Rafah, refugee camp, in the southern Gaza Strip. My attempts often failed, since the children became totally and incredibly out of control, and were filled with violence and savagery, using their hands, feet, and teeth to attack each other. Some of them no longer cried or screamed during the fights, neither while hitting nor being hit. Sometimes we would notice that a fight was breaking out from the sound of slaps or something crashing next to them. Salma, my granddaughter, who is exactly 2.5 years old, would be walking and punching the others. And old and young, right and left, without warning, I was drained by these battles, by trying to prevent them or end them or calm my thoughts when they were over. Okay, this is what's happening in the domestic sphere. And I was convincing myself that I was busy with this great mission that distracted me from press interviews that would neither nourish me nor relieve my hunger. Since what is prohibited and permissible are obvious, and whomever cannot see in their moral sieve that the Palestinians have a just cause are blind and will never see or understand anything, neither from press interviews nor from anything else. Moreover, the TV stations broadcast live the bombing of neighborhoods and their crowded homes and buildings falling on their heads of the residents, the bombing of hospitals with their wounded, and schools and churches with their thousands of displaced people. So, what will my words add to this deaf and blind world? Nothing. In addition to the task of preventing wars between children, I have another task that is no less important, which is the job of managing food provisions. This includes the procedure of cooking and then distributing ratios among men, women, and children, and receiving the bread and conserving it through drying, while hiding it away from the old white cat that comes through the window each night in search of food. These tasks are followed by supervising the disposal of the garbage that accumulates every day so that the cat won't find it and scatter it all over the house while we sleep. I beg you, don't underestimate these tasks of mine, as they are much more important than chattering to the press, and much easier than using the intermittent and unstable internet, and more comfortable for me than speaking in English, of which there is nothing left in my head. And to be even more honest, I'm also incapable of speaking Arabic with any fluency, or rather it takes me time to remember a lot of meanings, words, names, and expressions. This state makes me appear as if I've just woken up from sleep or from a coma. So let's agree that I carry out valuable field missions on the scene in my on the scene in the places of displacement where we have taken refuge. My joy over it is only marred by the sounds of bombing near and far, and the noise of generators running on gas, kerosene, and gasoline used to raise water to roofs that are heavy with tanks, firewood, old shoes, worn carpets, empty plastic bottles, and miscellaneous scrap. In addition to the washing line strung with hand-washed clothes that are still sodden with water because the tired hands of the women were unable to sufficiently wring them out. Especially since most of them are very young women who have never had to do washing by hand during the short span of their lives between one war and the next over the past 16 years. Yes, throughout these years we suffered from regular power outages, but the majority of women were able to keep washing their laundry in washing machine by scheduling the task according to when electricity was available. Even in the previous wars, the electricity was never cut off in such a total, continuous, and comprehensive way. One last bit, and then I'll stop. Oh God, how much people are stressed, scared, and nervous. We need years of treatment to be released from what we are in. We need years of treatment if we are not released from life before that. We need years of reconstruction and rebuilding to compensate for what's been destroyed. And we need more years in order to document and record the horrors we are experiencing. Horrors that we don't know when they will end. This is night after night in Rafah. I'm writing and I'm filled with great fear. May God protect us. It was our hardest night in Rafah. And sorry, I know this is a very long quote, but I think it really speaks for itself in terms of conveying the amount of care that goes in the domestic at times of war and destruction. The amount of the trauma that she's talking about, the horrors that the horrified kids who have become angry and unable to contain their rage after this was just only a month in the war. So imagine now after 5 months, and the importance, the cynicism towards the death and blind word, and the importance of carrying out ordinary acts of that kind of meaningful act of that guarantee the survival of the family, the washing, of clothes, the drying of bread, the searching for provisions, the calming down of the children. I mean, all these acts of domestic care become politicized acts of resistance, of survival, or of what Palestinians call sumud, which is the only thing that is left to you to kind of sustain presence over erasure. And obviously, I mean, there is no, I mean, we could say this in a very sophisticated and scholarly way, but I think that these words are very poetic in their own terms, because they describe and they convey so much of the importance of the domestic as a political sphere, of survival. Now, I had a long section on trauma and terror, and but I don't think I'll linger over this too much. But I wanted to say that for Palestinians, the idea of trauma, or the notion of trauma, is not an apt term, because trauma, as Primo Levi, for instance, in such of his great work, but in particular in one of his work called The Drowned and the Saved, explained, in order to heal for trauma, you need a framework. To use a medical terminology, like an end, you need the injury to be, you need, what do you call it, for the healing process to start, you need, first of all, a framework to which to insert your story, what you witnessed, what you went through. But also it needed to have ended, right? As if when you are sick of a physical injury, you would want, the healing process starts after you have recovered, you have recovered from the physical injury. But the problem is that this notion of trauma is not the apt term for Palestinians, because there has never been an ending. So it's ongoing. It's always been ongoing. And so this ongoingness, this lack of justice and reparation, and the constant sort of ongoingness of war means that we need new words and new concepts to define, the conditions, such as the conditions that these children were experiencing in the house or in the shelter. And so we look at literature of colonial trauma to understand and to find meanings and concepts that can explain what goes on when wars are constant, ongoing, where displacement has no end, when the injury has no end. And so we have a lot of really interesting, important literature coming from, the Algerian War, the Algerian Revolution, and colonial time, such as Karim Al-Azhar, who's a psychoanalyst and historian working, I think, in France, of Algerian descent, who has given us this notion of terror. But also, so terror as a psychic state that, unlike trauma, doesn't allow for forgetting or repression, that does not lead to the emergence of a new subjective position, but blurs the boundaries between the psychic apparatus and the biological body, between the singular and the collective, between the inside and the outside. So terror remains untethered. And terror is also a devastation that can even prevent the recognition of the state of terror by the subject who is suffering it. And I think all these kind of notions help us to understand, the long quote that I've shared with you from Gaza. Now, the question that we may draw from all this is, where does home leave us with in this context? Why do we need to look at home, and what is the political valence of home? I mean, partly I've explained that I think home is where the political act of care, of attending to the everyday ordinary tasks of remaining alive takes place, although it's far from a place where you feel protected, right? There is no inside and outside. It's in a shelter, in a tent. And however, I think home is also an important kind of paradigm to think about what is lost. As I mentioned, at the very basic level, what is lost in war and displacement is home, and not just simply an abstract notion of a homeland. And home as the affective site of continuous presence against erasure. So home is a material and affective site of relations, of attachments, but also of conflict and of reparation, like as we saw this woman carrying out work of reparation in the domestic sphere. Now, there was and I'm going to move now quickly to a second part of this talk, and there was an image that was circulating these last few weeks of people from Gaza holding the keys of their destroyed homes. And for those of you who are familiar with the Palestine question, the key, holding the key of your home, which was destroyed or taken away from you in 1948 when the State of Israel was created, is the symbolic, is the symbolic kind of iconography of the Palestine question and of the right of return of these refugees. So it was really shocking to see how these people in Gaza, who are 70% of them, if not 80% of them, are actually refugees themselves from 1948. It was quite shocking to see that they were holding their keys, not of their villages of origins, homes of their villages of origin that were destroyed in 1948, but the key of their refugee camp home in Gaza, the key of their shelters, the keys of the homes that they considered temporary until very recently. And so this got me thinking a lot about a lot of things, but in particular about how home, what does it mean to lose home and rebuild home in a context where in a context of ongoing and permanent multiple loss. So you have 1948, where you have been made a refugee for the first time, and this, there are, as I said, 80% of the population of Gaza is of refugee descent, and they have been waiting for 75 years to go back to their villages of origin. According to international law, Resolution 194, which gives them the right, what is called the right of return, the right to return to your home, to your ancestral villages, which have, however, as I said, been destroyed a long time ago. So the question becomes, that it's very obvious that home is no longer simply that place of the original loss. Home has become, after 4 generations of displacement, also the refugee camp in Gaza, which is the place where, generation after generation, people carried out that kind of everyday, ordinary work of presence against erasure. And so this really got me thinking about how home, and I mean, there is a lot that would need to be explained, but you know, in the context of the Palestine question, the idea of return to, you know, the right of return of Palestinian refugees is one of the quintessential characteristics of what Palestinians think of in terms of reparation. You know, there is no solution to the Palestine question without return of the refugees to their 1948 villages of origin, or the ruins of these villages. And however, these people were holding the key in the exact same ways of their refugee camp home. And so it got me thinking, and this is like in my wider work, about the way that return is never only to the past, is actually to the future. Is return has an aspirational element related to it, because it is about, you know, how do you return to something that no longer exists? And where do you return? Where is home after 75 years of displacement? And so I start to think about exactly home as contrapuntal to homeland, you know, and but also as in dialectic relationship to homeland. So there are all kinds of really interesting and important paths that need to be teased out in this dialectic and relation between home and homeland. Now, I mean, it was difficult to prepare this lecture because obviously I don't know how much you know. You know, I'm an anthropologist, you are working in another field. And I'm sure that you have anyway been very much exposed to different understandings of home. There is a long tradition within feminist and gender theory, Western feminist and gender theory, for whom home is actually the site of repression and patriarchal rules and regulations. And so home has become sort of the space, I mean, the space of domesticity has been, in Western feminist theory, deconstructed or analyzed critically as a place where women didn't find their freedom, for sure, or nor as a place to be celebrated, okay? So how come we are now thinking in this context of home as a space of the political? And this is what I want to eviscerate a little bit more. I mean, I wrote a lot about this, but in a nutshell, first of all, I want to say that there is a non-white communities have always had a completely different understanding of home. For instance, for a black family in the US, for an average African-American family whose kids are constantly imprisoned or if not shot at in the street, certainly the street is less of a protective space or less of an emancipatory space than the home that offers the protection of the family, the community, and so on and so forth. So home, in context of either colonial or neo-colonial or neoliberal, late capitalist, neoliberal kind of racial capitalist context, is certainly something that has already been problematized or represented as a safe space, differently from the way it is represented in white feminist liberal kind of theory, okay? So here you have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Bell Hooks. Have you ever heard about Bell Hooks? Yeah. So Bell Hooks, who has this really, I think, compelling quote where she says, so Bell Hooks was a feminist, queer feminist theorist, African-American, who's written so much important work on so many issues, particularly around, you know, black feminist thinking, and obviously the question of home is here quite interestingly posed. So she says, it is no accident that this home place, as fragile, as transitional as it may be, a makeshift shed, a small bit of earth when one rests, is always subject to violation and destruction. For when a people no longer have the space to construct home place, we cannot build a meaningful community of resistance. So obviously home in this connotation is a very fragile, precarious, I mean, it's certainly, we're talking about disenfranchised communities, you know, black and African-American communities in the US, for instance, where she worked, but it's also a place of protection, is also a place of sustenance, is a place of continuation, of presence against erasure. And so you would find similar ideas in the context of Native American indigenous populations, whose understanding of home is very different from Western liberal feminist thinking about it. Now, there is also some kind of continuity between, you know, what I've presented to you here today by bringing in this long quote from one of the Gaza survivor, whose name is actually Andalib, and the work of African Americans, who actually, I want to remind ourselves, are also living in the ruins of a settler colonial society and country, okay, which was built as a settler colonial, through a settler colonial violent enterprise, okay? And so she says, this is again Bell Hooks, who says, you know, talks about home, place, again, in just juxtaposition to homeland. Black women's homes are sites of resistance and have always been central to the black family's sense of well-being, which offers protection from white power structures. So again, another instance of how home is a political site of community building and resistance, and not just a space of the domestic or of women's oppression, let's say. Home is also what has nurtured revolutionary force, which was valuable for black women living in racist societies. So there is this juxtaposition of home and community, home and survival, home and protection, from institutionalized forms of racism, institutionalized and violent forms of necropolitics, you know, killing, the killing of and disposability of black and brown bodies in the US is, I don't need to explain this, obviously. But also the ethos of care, which is another central element of decolonial thinking. Obviously, the ethos of care was also there in certain white feminist theory, but here I'm talking about the caring responsibilities not related just to your immediate kin, but in a often redefined family formations that have very little to do with consanguinity, right? It's about community, it's about resistance and community. And, you know, concluding that African American women have a long history of community work where they have attempted to sustain the community, which is linked to efforts to transform the larger society. So from here, I quickly move to the camp, to the refugee camp, and this is my concluding section. I hope I still have 10 minutes. So this is a picture, as I mentioned to you, I have for many years worked on refugee camps, and my work as an ethnographer has been linked to an attempt to understand what is a camp, what is a refugee camp after 75 years or 4 generations of life in it, okay? What is a refugee camp in a context where there are so many refugee camps that one can no longer, especially in the Middle East, can no longer see the camp as an exceptional site, as a site of suspension of an order that is going to be soon recovered, right? So I'm just going to try to explain this complex idea through some visual images. So this is one of the camps that I worked in, the Heysha camp in the West Bank. And this is an image of what it was like in 1948. And this was one of the first shelters after the tents. So you have tents in 1948, and then you have some first shelters that were actually makeshifts that were built by people themselves with whatever material was available. And in the iconography of Palestine, the zinc roof is one of the things, like when you talk about zinc as material, you think about Palestinian refugee camps, because zinc was what the roof was made of. And there is a whole aesthetic about the camp, and I know you have Alessandro Petti and Sandy Hilal coming here to talk about as architects about the built habitat, the built environment of the camp, so I'm not going to talk about it. But from my perspective as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, what is interesting is to see the transformation. So this is like from 48, the tents to today. This is Dheisha today. So you know, it's a city, really. You know, it's an urban neighborhood. So the question that I have been asking myself, again, thinking through the lens of home, is what happens in context of protracted waiting, you know, where these people have been waiting for 75 years in a camp to go home, in theory, you know, to go home to villages that they were forced to flee in 1948. And so the camp had to retain a characteristic where you are at home, but it shouldn't be really your home, because if it becomes your home, it means that you are not returning. You are relinquishing your right of return. So this whole issue of how do you build a home that is a temporary one, while simultaneously, over generations, having to provide a sense of, you know, care, a sense of continuous presence, a sense of development, a sense of, no, you cannot ask people to live for 4 generations as intense, right? And in such state of precarity. So how do you maintain a sense of precarity, of being here but not to remain, while simultaneously constructing a sense of home for yourself? Okay, this is my complex question that I'm asking myself when I look at the camp. Now, there is some really interesting work on waiting in anthropology. I don't know whether in architecture you'd have similar interesting ideas about waiting. And I have to say that the actual material through which the infrastructures are built, so the kind of material that is used, for instance, I was talking to a friend earlier about the fact that, you know, people in Gaza, for instance, before this war, they stopped buying buildings. They stopped buying their houses because they knew they would be destroyed by bombs. But also the Israelis only let in certain kind of materials, certain kind of cement or certain kind of building material, and very little of it. So there is a whole generation of students in Gaza who have come up with all kinds of new materials. They invented, you know, new materials to build homes and to build infrastructure, which I think is interesting in itself, to think about the material as a force of resistance as well, no? But here I'm interested in the kind of idea of waiting, what happens in the waiting, and how this waiting is projected onto the aesthetic of the camp. How do you make sure that the camp remains a camp while not being subjugated by the conditions of precarity of a camp, okay? So I've been interested in my work in looking at these aesthetics as sites of this tension, or where this tension is negotiated and displayed and played out. So obviously in anthropology we say that there is waiting is composed of a politics of waiting, that is the structural the structural ways in which institutions and powers compel you to wait. So the kind of top-down idea that waiting is obviously a way to control people's time, is a way to appropriate your body, your time, by various dispositives, like you can think about migration and how people kept in detention, kept in camps. And there is a proliferation of all kinds of different types of camps: detention camps, repatriation camps, prison camps, and so on and so forth. And so the appropriation of your time through the imprisoning of your body is what we call the politics of waiting. The people around the world are compelled and obliged to wait. You see this in airports or everywhere, even in your everyday experience. Some people walk fast and some people are sitting on chairs waiting endlessly until their passports are checked, and so on. So now there is the politics of waiting, but there is also a poetics of waiting, which which has to do with what we call the existential affordances of the engagement in and with time. And the poetics of waiting also means acknowledging that in this waiting, which, as I said, and I will show in a minute, has an aesthetic, material dimension in the camp. In this waiting, there are all kinds of subjective positions that emerge. There is what Arjun Appadurai calls the ability and the capacity to aspire for a future. Waiting is a space of coexistence between doubt and hope. Okay, you're waiting, hoping that things will change, and you're doubting, but you're hoping. And so all this space of poetics of waiting has to do with the affordances that waiting confers to people, and the kind of with desire as well. And so waiting can bring about, different types of attitudes and social energies, which I think is really important to also give refugees agency and not to think of them just as subjects of humanitarian aid who have been sitting there waiting for, the next ratio of UN aid. There have been 75 years of people inhabiting this waiting in an interplay between doubt and hope, which has given rise to a whole political culture, okay? So for instance, I'm interested in the way that people in the camp don't own their homes. They do own them informally, but they don't own them according to a liberal propertied sense of ownership, because this is, you're living in a temporary context. And the land is not yours, it's the UN's land or some family land that has given concession to the UN. So what does it mean to own temporarily, for instance? I'm interested in all these imaginaries. I'm interested in the fact that a lot of people don't have the key, homes don't have keys. So I'm interested in this in this poetic of waiting. But and what kind of affordances they offer, what kind of political visions, living in a condition that is outside the condition of capitalism or straightforward capitalist, property, possessive, liberal notions of existence offers, but also outside of the mere subjugation of humanitarianism. You are inhabiting, every day building a future while staying in a spatio-temporal condition of waithood, okay? Now, this actually is a little bit back to what I was saying before, that camps are omnipresent. It's not that, you have one camp every here and there. You have, this is a map of, very old, in fact, that map of distribution of camps and gatherings in the Middle East, and it's actually not even quite up to date. So you can see even spatially how a camp is not a space of exception, is a constant presence in the wider spatial arrangement of the region. This is a picture that I find interesting because people wouldn't notice, but this is Dheisha camp again in the West Bank near Bethlehem. And the problem is that, in the people, there are so many people now that there were originally, that there was a need to expand the camp, okay? However, you cannot expand the camp because it's not, the land is not yours. You cannot simply expand the camp. It's governed by humanitarian agencies and what have you. So people started to build or to go live out just in the immediate proximity of the camp, just outside, in a neighborhood that was actually supported, which building was supported by Qatar. It's called Doha. But what is interesting about it is that when you ask people, so how did it feel to move out of the camp in Doha, in this annexed kind of contiguous neighborhood? Does it feel like you have relinquished your right of return to leave the camp, to leave this space where you have been waiting, for so long? And they say, no, we carry the camp with us. So the camp becomes a set of social relations, an identity that has only partly to do with the spatial inhabited element of the camp. It is an idea that you carry with you because you are a refugee, and wherever you go, the camp comes with you. And I think this is also very interesting. Now, one really interesting thing that I guess our friends Alessandro and Sandy will talk more about, because they've worked a lot on this, is about the way that people, for instance, in this waiting, they discuss every single detail of camp improvement. If you improve the camp too much, there's this constant tension between improving the camp and normalizing the camp. So if you improve the camp through a lot of renovation and of infrastructures and so on, you run the risk of making this situation permanent. And so people negotiate all the time, you know, what is allowed within this idea of camp improvement that doesn't normalize the camp as a space that that loses its temporary connotation. Because obviously, if you ameliorate so much, that people think, well, that means that we'll be staying here forever because we now are happy here. This is our new home. So it's very interesting to see how people negotiate the human need to live better lives without relinquishing the temporary nature of the camp. So, for instance, in this tension between maintaining this kind of permanent temporary dimension of the camp, there is, I think, a way in which also the occupation becomes temporary, because you're not giving up, right? You're not giving up your right of return. This keeping the camp temporary by not renouncing a dignified life, if you can, is I think, a really interesting sphere to capture this kind of refugee political culture, which is played out so much on the aesthetic and the infrastructure of the camp as well. So that there is a lot of discussion around what kind of amelioration. Does building a square in the camp mean normalizing the camp, or does it mean bettering my life? If I'm offered to go to a hospital that is outside the camp, that is not a UN hospital, does it mean that I am relinquishing my status as a refugee, or am I allowed to do that? Let alone the fact that the camp actually itself has become home to so many migrants. So the refugee camp is no longer a place where only refugees live. So it's sociologically, morphologically, a neighborhood as well, with all kinds of dynamics at work. So how do you preserve the identity of a refugee camp after 75 years of transformations? And each camp, it's unique in its own ways. There are so many different camps, and each one has its own dynamics. Through very much through an aesthetic as well as the kind of negotiations around resources and access to certain types of spaces such as squares or not. There is an aesthetic that becomes crucial here. So, for instance, this you see here, Baqa camp in Jordan, which is really an immense neighborhood in the city center of Amman, where the Jordanian government has tried many times to make the camp part of the urban texture by transforming it even formally into a neighborhood instead of a camp. And so what people do constantly, there are constant kind of attempts to resist this attempt to make the camp an urban neighborhood, because that would mean that you're relinquishing your temporary life there. But with the reckoning that, this is the fourth generation of people living there, And so you have all kinds of aesthetics. So you have a lot of graffiti that remind people that they are refugees, that remind people of the history of refugeehood, of displacement, of the right of return. And there are actual day-to-day also forms of resistance. For instance, when the government comes in and wants to expand the roads to make it possible for cars to go through, but also to fragment it, to make it less knitted. That there are a lot of resistances to that, like that people want to keep the camp as a camp aesthetically and in terms of the kind of the roads and the narrow roads and so on and so forth. And this is like just at the entrance of Baka camp, what you find is Love Baka, welcome to Baka camp. So there is a sign that says this is a camp, right? And to make sure that whoever comes from outside knows that this is not just an urban neighborhood, because it's so now widespread that you hardly notice that you are going from, the normal kind of urban context of Amman to a camp. And finally, there is a whole aesthetic of refugeehood played out in arts, on people's homes, on the walls. So you see that there is a lot of there are a lot of vernacular museums in the houses, because the camps have become also places of immigration. A lot of people have left from Lebanon, from Jordan, because in Lebanon in particular there is no, or in Palestine there is no work, and so people have become economic migrants elsewhere, and so that means that they have come home and they have rebuilt sometimes different types of homes, but they have kept the first original shelter and they made them into vernacular museums with work of art that keep alive this memory of and present day reality of still being a refugee. So aesthetic practices, vernacular museums become really some of the prominent ways in which this political culture of permanent temporariness becomes entrenched and kept alive. I think I'll stop here because I've gone well over my time, and I thank you so much for listening.
Now, yes. So thank you very much, Ruba, for your lecture. A lecture that allows us to discuss the history of refugees as an heritage, just to quote Sandy and Alessandro project, and refugees camps as a collective place that can stimulate urban processes and domestic reappropriation. There are many subjects that could be discussed, also in terms of architecture, the question of care, waiting, and temporarity. Three terms that I think it's really interesting, and sometimes we can also imagine care in contrast with waiting and temporarity. But as you explained, care is also an element that could create a community. And so if we think care in this term, we can change also the meaning of care. And another thing, the question of the home as a political place that can change meanings in different culture. And when we listen when we listen the interview that you read to us, it was fantastic because we can imagine the space of the house and the movement in this kind of domesticity. So thanks a lot. And I don't want to monopolize the 10 minutes that we have for questions. And so do you have some questions for Ruba? Or curiosity, or yes.
Many thanks. I'm not an architect, I'm economist, unfortunately. I'm working on in transportation and especially on refugees and how you move people, especially in camp. Just for the anecdote, in informal cities in South America, they refuse also roads because they don't want that the state and any kind of authorities that can be figured out with a car can enter these informal cities. And also in this kind of informal cities, there is no ownership. So I'm not sure that there is a link between ownership and home. But at the end of your presentation, I'm still puzzled by the fact there is no definition of home. And what I have in mind are more the work of anthropologists like Françoise Héritier, who are saying that home is more a question of cultures, and depending on the cultures, it can be a settlement plus food and language. And reading the work of on refugees, political or not, or economic refugees, it seems that home is more related to language and food. That's my first question. And especially the related question is when you compare with colonial trauma, there are some population that home were, especially migrant population in some tribes in the US, native, some were settled, some were not settled. And the way to destroy them was to destroy their relation to nature and not to specific home or settlement. So I would like to understand how you can differentiate the analytical grid when you refer to colonial trauma. And the last question, have you checked the work of the group of researchers around Cécile Azuna-Maris in Fukushima, where they explain that they have refugees and the origin of these refugees is twofold. One, you have the one causes is the tsunami, so the natural causes. The other one is the nuclear plant. So it's from human resources. And there is a work showing that the people are suffering of two kinds of trauma. First, the fact that they were harassed, they have to move from their home. That means farms, housing, and so on. And after the repeated trauma of that they have to move from one camp of it's not a camp, it's a settlement of refugees, and how the society discard them. So, and the anthropologist who's working with Cécile, showing that there is accumulation of trauma, of two kinds of crisis trauma. So I would like if you have read that, of crisis trauma. The one who is one-shot trauma and the repeated trauma. The fact that you have to move and the fact, for example, you have no food every day, no water every day, it's a repeated trauma compared to the fact you are expelled. So I would like to know if you have, you are aware of this kind of work and to see if you, in your case, you can apply this framework of two kinds of trauma.
If you want, yes. Okay, yeah. Yes. We collect some questions and then she will answer. Sorry, I must pass the mic. And of course, we can use also French if you want.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your time, ma'am, and for this very enlightening presentation. My question is very simple, but perhaps not that so simple. No, every cities have borders or frontiers, and I'd like to know what does the notion of frontier means in the context of camp, right?
Are there other questions? Vous avez d'autres questions qu'on peut collecter aussi en français? C'est pas grave, ça va? Ok, alors pour l'instant, on répond à ces questions et après, éventuellement, on continue.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. They are all really important questions, and I thank you so much for also for suggestions of other work. So for me, home, I kind of think through the concept, through the idea of social relations, and more than the kind of spatial. So, for instance, I have written an article some time ago about where I use affective theory, where I use sort of the notion of the body, that, you know, what is lost in war, and the way that the oral memories of women who I talked to, who were the generation of my grandmother, they were all related to the loss of the domestic, and the place where they had, and especially, this is all pre-October of the 7th. The domestic, there was a lot of resentment also towards the men who went to do the revolution and left behind, you know, the women and the children to do the work, you know, the work of care, which is the actual essential work for the continuation of the community, you know. And so for me, kind of, I didn't provide a sociological definition of home, but I looked at homing, if you wish, like homing as the continuous practices of sumud for Palestinians, of keeping the community alive, of making sure that there is another generation in the future. So it's of the place where the actual, if you want, the real resistance happens, which is the everyday work of reparation that is needed for the outside cows to not just own people's bodies and brains as a form of terror, as it's described by. So for me, the heroic gestures and everyday work of these men and women who, even in Gaza today, are sweeping the floor, doing the washing. You know, we heard the testimony of a professor whose university has been destroyed, who was saying that he lost his his hearing ability, because he spent nights in ends putting his hands on his children's ears to not, because of the bombing outside, you know, the amount of, and so he lost half of his hearing ability. And so, but there is a more political reason why I don't define home, because in a way, again, there is this constant tension between home and homeland. And so when you try to define home for Palestinian refugees who have been waiting whose ultimate home in the whole Palestinian national discourse has always been the home that you left in 1948. So it's very difficult to politically engage with an idea of home as a permanent site. And so this constant sense of, I mean, that's why I keep referring to a transient space made of certain types of social relations that stand in constant tension with the national, with the homeland, as the imagined space of belonging and of loss. So that's my kind of short answer, although I know that there is much more to say. There's, but definitely one definition that I use, and I talk about home via the issue of love as a social muscle, and of Laurent Berlin's notion of infrastructures of proximity. Because also this allows me to account for a dynamic and a constant, ever-shifting definition of home. It's a homing practice in displacement that I'm looking at. And about trauma, I think, yes, I think, I mean, the Palestinian scholarly work has been very critical towards the notion of trauma, because trauma is often has been hijacked by NGOs, by humanitarian work, who, you know, in the face of others. in the face of an ongoing occupation and an ongoing, in this moment, genocide, what they have been offering, you know, was not a political resolution of the conflict, but sort of trauma recovery work, very individually based. And so I've tried to look for other kinds of notions that can account for a more systemic, not individual, and more political idea of what is experienced through this ongoingness, which can be seen as, you know, two types of trauma, but I prefer to talk about, you know, notions such as terror, such as Karima Lazar talks about in the context of colonial Algeria, which is something that remains untethered, because how can you talk about something that, how can you elaborate or heal from something that never happened because it has never finished, it has never ended. It hasn't happened yet because it's constantly happening. You are in it. And so it's untethered. Terror is untethered. It's both a psychic and a physical injury. And I think it's very well described, the condition of terror as a psychic and physical injury by the word of Andalib in this long testimony, where she talks about the anger of the children, the biting, the inability to put an end to it, unless via very, very ordinary tasks of trying to carry out as much as possible the work of managing, of care, of providing for the little ones, in a way that it becomes much more political than, as she says, talking to the journalists, for instance, or speaking in English and offering the narrative, the big narrative of what's going on, you know. So for me, terror is what encompasses this untethered, ongoing, never-ending state of being in a 7-decade-long history of dispossession. And then the question on border of the camp, I think it's a really interesting one, because as I tried to show, there isn't really, what's going on? There isn't really a border in the camp. There are, people are enacting borders to keep the camp defined as such, spatially. But the borders are after so many decades of living in displacement and of expansion of these settings. I think they are much more. They have much more to do with this political work of keeping it alive as a. For instance, I'll give you an example. In the Heysha camp, when the Palestinian Authority came back from exile and after the Oslo agreements, some of the refugee camps were the fences that normally used to encircle the camps were taken off, symbolically to say, you know, you're no longer, you know, you're somehow you're at home, although this is not your home because your home is in 1948. And yet the camp residents were adamant to keep the gate, just the gate that stands up there without unhinged, like it is not attached to any other fence, but there is this gate, which they didn't want to get rid of because it symbolizes this border, that you are entering a camp. And there is even a statement at the entrance of the camp that says you are entering the Heysha camp. So it's that kind of work that, yeah.
Thank you very much. One last question. Yes. Last one, because it's 2:30, and I think then you have some courses. Sorry? We have to go. Yeah. If you want, you can go, of course. So sorry.
So my question was, if home is the long-term healing of trauma caused by the longing of coming back, how do you envision or witness a long-term healing in a temporary house or camp? And according to you, okay,
You can come here.
yeah, I'll do.
No, you can stay, but just repeat it because
I'll do it without it. It's easier. So, if home is the long-term healing of trauma, and it's healing because you have this longing to coming back, how do you envision or witness a long-term healing, also a complete healing in this temporary house or camp? And it seems as if from your first answers that it came from ordinary life. So that's my question, if it's clear. Or is it even possible to heal completely?
No, it's a great question. It's impossible to heal because the point is like trauma has this connotation as the individual work of repair that is needed for an individual to feel better. And obviously there are a lot of psychotherapists in Palestine. Like even in Gaza, there has been a tradition of attempting to tackle the individual injury. Or even the everyday problems that people have, and then everyone in the world, that need to be attended to through some psychic reparation. The problem is that in a context of occupation, and where the occupation is ongoing, the collective healing is not possible until the political solution is found, until the occupation comes to an end, and so it speaks to the wider condition of the Palestinian people. Like how do you carry on with your life in a context of permanent and constant? I mean, this is longest occupation of modern history. The Algeria was colonized for more than 100 years, of course, and India, but in sort of there is an anachronism that all these experiences have ended with liberation. New problems have emerged, so people are still in need of a lot of therapy. But the collective healing in a context where the original violation has not come to an end, it is simply an impossible task. And that's why I'm referring to this concept of terror, because it allows to capture the political dimension that, yes, as an individual you can maybe have a little bit of a better life by doing this or the other, or by telling your story. The narrating has a liberatory potential. It's telling the story, being heard, but collectively there is no process of healing, and there is no permanent home, because it's a history of ongoing form of dispossessions that have accompanied the life of 4 generations of people.
So it's temporary home, temporary healing.
I would say, yeah, that could be. I don't know. I don't think there is a healing. There is a management of the grief. There is a management of. There is a huge collective trauma, and all our lives are entrenched and part of this collective canvas. So there is not one single Palestinian story that is not somewhat connected to and depending on and marked by the history, the collective history of dispossession. And so there are individual kind of ways of managing it, but the original collective trauma that has not been solved, has not been addressed. On the contrary, I very much like the work of Primo Levi on memory and trauma as well, although from a very different context. And Primo Levi was an Auschwitz survivor. He was very critical of Zionism as a political project. He was a survivor, and he wrote a lot of really, I think, really important work that in Italy we read from school, although we don't understand it, because it's too complex to fully grasp the meaning of it. But in one of his work, he talks about memory, and one of his work, which is the one I quoted, The Drowned and the Saved. And he says that basically, he talks about the burden of surviving, the burden, the irreparable burden of remaining alive when the others have perished, right? But also he talks about whose narrative are we, whose memory can be narrated, because he says, the most genuine people were the one who were killed at first in the camp. The one who were genuine, who didn't compromise, who didn't do tricks to survive, who didn't compromise their ethics. Although ethics in a condition of suspension of humanity is obviously in itself impossible, but if you see what I mean, like they would compromise with the guardians, they would do that. These were the ones who survived. Whereas those who died, who were the first to be killed, were the ones who didn't compromise ever, who stood for themselves. And so this poses a huge question about healing and memory of the survivors. And I feel very much about this in the sense that I constantly feel that those who are being sacrificed right now cannot speak for themselves. So even in giving this talk, I find it really hard to engage, because we are at the limit of the thinkable. We are in such a context where, as we speak, every minute, children are being killed, and 1,800,000 people are living in makeshifts, and the place has become inhabitable. Like, it's been a race to the ground, as I said, 70% of the infrastructure, so that people will not, the idea is for them not to be able to ever return. And so I think we are at a time where all these issues about trauma and memory and bearing witness and home are pushed to such limit that it's even difficult to talk about it.
Okay, I believe we can continue talking with you all day, but we are at the end of our second conference. Unfortunately, we must end the conference because I know that you will have some courses at 3 o'clock, I think, somehow like that. Donc, merci beaucoup pour la participation. Merci beaucoup, Ruba, pour la conférence que tu nous as donnée, pour tous les thèmes qui très intéressants dont tu nous as parlé, thèmes auxquels je pense on a aussi besoin de continuer à réfléchir, même en tant qu'architecte. Donc, de la possibilité de convertir certains des sujets que tu as touchés et que j'ai listés à la fin de ta conférence en termes de projets. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on peut imaginer en tant qu'architecte. Donc, vraiment, merci beaucoup. Ça a été très intéressant. Et juste deux derniers mots pour vous rappeler que la prochaine semaine, on aura deux conférences, donc une longue journée. Une conférence de Kersengers, de Office. Le titre est The Big House, mais la conférence, je pense, sera en français. Et la conférence sera à l'école à 13h. Donc, on parlera avec Kirsten à 13h. Et après, les soirs, à 19h, à l'Ensa Val-de-Seine, on aura une conférence de Sophie Delay sur la question de la désassignation appliquée au système de la pièce et du logement. Donc, on se voit la prochaine semaine avec ces programmes un peu chargés, mais tout à fait intéressants. Merci encore et à bientôt et bon après-midi. Au revoir.
On n'a pas les tout à l'heure. Il a dit fais tout ça, c'est un grand peu de Sophie. Oui, mais je sais, mais c'est la critique. Oui, je sais. Normalement, il va tout faire pour que ça soit un peu intéressant.
Elles savent, mais c'est dans l'auditoire, c'est normalement c'est l'auditoire de l'université de Val-de-Seine, mais merci. Ciao Laurent, merci beaucoup. Che sono facilissime da riportare tantissimo.
Mi sono rifatta quello che hai detto nell'introduzione.
Sì, no, ma guarda, ha funzionato tantissimo perché oggi, che è un momento di fortissima rimessa in discussione dell'architettura, è come se tu avessi toccato una serie di temi che portano nella contemporaneità l'architettura a mettersi in discussione. Quindi, in realtà è...
No, anche perché non posso far finta di essere un'architetta.
No,
quello che so.
Non lo so, c'erano dei momenti della tua conferenza in cui quando ti ascoltavo immaginavo e mi sentivo in dei luoghi e mi sentivo in dei luoghi che erano costruiti da delle persone e li ascoltavo, non so come dirti, e tutto questo fa parte del tutto detto oggi, momento di discussione del care, la questione della temporaneità, l'architettura è centrale, la questione tutti questi sono temi, sì, il temporaneo contro il durabile che anche ha a che vedere con, perché abbiamo un concetto di durabilità dell'architettura molto forte oggi legato al problema della sostenibilità, no? Ma in realtà questa durabilità è ancora una volta culturale, perché c'è chi invece ragiona su tempi che sono diversi, che non sono durabili, per cui se loro sono riusciti, e quello penso di sì, ce n'erano molti del primo, ma anche loro mi sembra carichi anche quelli del primo anno. Il ragazzino che ha fatto la domanda alla fine è un ragazzino del primo anno di architettura, bellino. E per cui no, penso che li abbia... Te lo dico sinceramente, perché io ho sentito tensione dall'inizio alla fine della conferenza, non mai sentito. A parte quando c'è stata la questione del video, che vabbè, sono ragazzi.
Non tutti, secondo me.
Là, je vais vraiment rien avoir.
Se ci prendiamo
Ma certo.
parliamo anche del lab.
Certo. Ma io sono a tua disposizione oggi, sono la tua serva.
Addirittura.
Dopo ieri che ti ho bidonato, oggi non posso fare la serva.
Bidonato, figurati. A parte che io ieri pomeriggio mi sono accasciata, ho viaggiato da Boston e
povera, è vero.
La notte, no? E il volo per andare a Boston era vuoto. Però era di giorno, dici chi se ne frega, non è quello
Sì.
questo qui di notte non c'era un sedile vuoto. Io veramente ero con the sheep, quelli più poveri, in stiva. Quindi ieri non mi succede mai, ho dormito in hotel.
Fatto bene, mentre noi soffrivamo.
Sono finita con Sandro, che ha detto che stasera lui verrebbe fuori a far cena con suo fratello, che è qua.
Assolutamente.
Judith ha detto, peccato che non posso venire a sentire la tua lezione. Io ho detto, ma scusa, se tu vieni a sentire la mia lezione la gente smette di volermi ascoltare perché ci sei tu nella stanza.
Ma è stato carino anche il fatto che ci fossero delle persone dell'italiano. Della seconda. Sono venute qua. Mai è successo in Roma, non ho mai visto gente della seconda.
Come sapevo, ce l'ha scritto?
No, sono entrata la docente dicendo un peu en retard, désolé. Très bien passé. Sì. È entrata. Esatto, è entrata dicendo che era una professoressa di italiano. Non ho capito bene di che disciplina. Trasporti, italiano.
Sociologia urbana.
Forse una roba così, sì. Qualcosa delle